Good morning. Welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm joined by Batya, Ungar-Sargon. Nice to see you, Batya. How was your Thanksgiving?
It was wonderful. How was yours, Robby?
Oh, it was very good. I had my mom in town. Had some very good food with a friend, colleague of mine who is a much better cook than I am and makes delicious craft cocktails. So it was a very enjoyable Thanksgiving over here.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
All right. Well, what's on our agenda today?
So Rob Smith and Michael LaRosa will be joining us as our Rising panel, and we're going to get into the Mar-a-Lago visitor that has former President Donald Trump under fire. Plus, later we'll be discussing new pushback to the Biden administration's military spending in Ukraine. But first, COVID cases and death rates are up across the country amidst dropping temperatures and holiday gatherings. So much so that Chief White House medical advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci told CBS News yesterday that more school lockdowns are not off the table. Let's take a look at that.
So coming out of the holidays, should parents expect schools to shut down?
I don't know, Margaret. I'm not sure. When you talk about shutting down schools, there's always the collateral
That's also
effects.
radioactive.
It is, exactly. There's always the collateral issue. So you have to balance, and you do it in real time, depending upon the viral load of disease in your region.
Now, in Washington, D.C., public school students will be required to show proof of a negative COVID test to return to in-person instruction after the holiday weekend.
Well, renewed talks of lockdowns in the U.S. come as demonstrations erupt in China over the country's strict zero-COVID policy. Protests were triggered after 10 people were killed in a deadly apartment fire in the western city of Urumqi, which has been under strict lockdown for over 100 days. Videos of the incident suggest that zero-COVID measures actually delayed firefighters from reaching the victims. Now, thousands of protesters have taken to the streets across over 50 locations in China, most notably in the hubs of Beijing and Shanghai. In addition to the end of zero COVID, demonstrators demand Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping step down. So I think that's not, surprising to see, given, China's just total commitment to this strategy that I think is insane and impossible. You can't trap people in their homes for this long before they start, demanding basic human liberty. So it's really interesting to watch that taking place. What did you make of what's happening in China?
The phrase that keeps coming back to me over and over is huddled masses yearning to be free. Like there's, obviously China's an authoritarian regime. It's, not democratic by any means. There's no human rights or civil rights. And to see these people using COVID as the last straw to demand the kinds of freedoms and representation and to demand a voice, it's very moving, but also one feels terrified for them because obviously, the Chinese Communist Party does not respect the right of its citizens to protest. So a combination of respect and awe, but also fear for these people.
All right, well, let's turn back to the U.S. COVID context. Look, I don't know. Why do we go first to schools every time there's the cases are ticking up again, et cetera? But we're going to that's what we're talking about, shutting down schools. No, restaurants are going to shut down. Businesses, I don't think, are going to shut down. But schools, for some reason, it's always schools, even though children are the least affected population by both COVID in terms of death and long-term disease. Long COVID, we've also heard that doesn't affect young people as much, et cetera. So that's all. But the conversation is always about schools. And I don't know, I didn't appreciate Dr. Fauci could have been a lot more full-throated there, saying, no, we know shutting down schools was a mistake. We're not going to do it. That's that. We'll strive to have better ventilation in schools, et cetera. If, I guess if schools want to require tests, okay. Now, a one-off test doesn't necessarily tell you, from what I understand, you can be sick, you can be ill, you can be symptomatic with COVID, and you can test negative. I get it's not maybe like other interventions. I don't think it's necessarily harming, but it's not necessarily telling you everything you want to know either.
Yeah, there's a great quote from a former teachers union leader in New York. I forget which one it was, where somebody asked him, when are you going to start standing up for children? And his answer was when they join a union. And I just think that this is, I mean, I'm probably going to get crushed for saying this, but this is what happens when, members of the educated elite join unions and end up using the power of that union to wage war on working class and poor children who need public schools. I mean, and that's what's happened here is that, we think about COVID as being about politics, but it's really not. It's class warfare by people who are educated, who are part of the elites, against the working classes. And I'm not saying that teachers are, the most well-paid people in America. They're not, but they are part of a class whose interests are very much about lockdown, staying home, working from home, when their job is to help children get an education, right? So there is a clash of interests between the producers of public school and the consumers of it. And the public school unions, led by Randi Weingarten, have been on the wrong side of this over and over and over. And if you're not angry about this, I don't know what to tell you, because our most vulnerable people in this country are surely disabled children. I mean, who deserves our empathy more than disabled children? And yet they are the ones who again and again and again are simply abandoned by this view of COVID lockdown. And it's so enraging to me, Robby. Our empathy is placed so much in the wrong place on this question.
And somebody needs to watch young kids so their parents can work and do everything they need to do. That's why you're so right to say that it's an attack on working class people who don't have other options but to rely on the public education system. That's part of the reason it's there for. Not just educating your kids, but providing a very vital daycare function. That's why it was the spectacle during COVID or earlier in COVID was so ridiculous when the schools, the teachers, because they had the protection of the union, were not working or they were virtual, but you still had to have someone in the classroom to watch kids. So you were hiring like an additional employee. The only reason they were doing that is because the teachers had the protection, like you said, of that union. And it makes no sense, but that was the reality. So I'm glad most schools, I don't
anticipate. By the way, hiring
ahead.
A working class employee, right?
Yeah.
Like a teacher's aide or somebody who's not paid as well, who's not part of the union, to do the dirty work of showing up. I mean, that's the problem here, is the outsourcing of the dangerous work to people who are less privileged than you in every way.
Yeah. So Fauci had his last, I think, official day. It was the last press conference from the White House last week. On Tuesday, he had his final remarks were on urging everyone to get vaccinated, et cetera, kind of, defending his role. He was hailed by the White House press secretary and Dr. Jha as like the most important public health servant in, the history of the United States. Probably he is, for better or worse, the most well-known figure in that position. Do you think, Batya, that, what do you think Dr. Fauci's legacy will be in the future? Will he be, because he's become such a more polarized figure, and initially in the pandemic he wasn't, but the right, Republicans, COVID mitigation weary people really dislike him. Is that going to close? Is that wound going to close back up over time, or what do you think?
I respect his medical knowledge. I just think that something else got in the way when it came to COVID. He was given the authority and the power to weigh in on questions that are really questions of public policy, not questions of virology. And he did not have the humility to say, this is beyond my expertise, right? So I think that was really the problem. And that's, I think, what why they're so angry is at this overreach and the sort of the idea that I am the science, I represent the science. And I completely agree with you. When he was on the other side of President Trump, you had a kind of push and pull, right? And that was, I think, very fruitful. I mean, I think they came up with there was a good back and forth there. But the minute the Biden administration took over, this just became a regime that you couldn't object to, despite it being so deeply unpopular. And so when I talk to mothers, when I talk to working class people, and especially when you talk to Republicans, they are very, very, very angry. And I think with good reason. How much of that is his fault rather than the people around him who listened to him and gave him that power, I'm not really sure.
Well, and he frankly seems to look up to the kind of zero COVID strategy that China has pursued, I think, to its detriment. But you can imagine him wishing he had that level of power to compel people to follow, mitigation efforts more strictly. That's what he said when you and I interviewed him on the show. He said, if I could do it all over again, I wish I had recommended even stronger lockdowns, shutdowns, et cetera. We're seeing how that goes.
Well, I'm not sure it's fair to compare that to China's, to say that he wished that's the policy we would have followed is not necessarily to say he wishes we were living in that sort of China context. And even in his answer on CBS about whether schools will be locked down again, he sort of hedged by saying, well, it depends on the individual needs of the different areas, right? Although I don't understand why the needs of working class New Yorkers, for example, would be erased in that, right? I mean, he was sort of saying, look, each place will make its own decision. But overall, I think he was very much on the wrong side of many of these issues, and it was to a disastrous effect.
All right, Batya, you'll tell us what's on your radar coming up next. Stay tuned for that.